Rianna, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Mark. I am really happy to be here today. Thank you so much to Portfolio Institutional for giving me the platform to speak today. And thanks to the other panelists, because I am not from the field of asset management, so I've learned a lot from hearing from all of you. So as Mark said, I'm a divestment campaigner for Friends of the Earth. I'm probably going to be taking a slightly different approach to some of the speakers we've had today, sort of coming at this from the angle of being a climate campaigner. I'm just going to speak first a little bit about who Friends of the Earth are. I'm sure many of you will have heard of us before. We are a charitable organisation and part of an international community dedicated to protecting the natural world and the well-being of everyone within it. We've been doing this kind of work for the past 50 years. We lead campaigns, we provide resources and information, and we try to drive real solutions to the environmental problems that are facing us all. In my role specifically, I work in a coalition called UK Divest, and what we do is provide support to individuals and groups within their communities who are campaigning for the sort of institutions that they are tied to and care about to stop investing in fossil fuel companies, such as their local council pension funds, their churches and universities. So just to give you a bit of a heads up of what I'm sort of planning to go through today. So firstly, we're going to talk a little bit about the climate crisis more broadly, how long we have, who's responsible and what's needed. I'll try not to make it too doom and gloom. Then going to talk a little bit about what fossil fuel divestment is and why we think it's the most effective tactic for actually addressing the climate crisis as an investor. Going to talk a little bit about the financial case for divestment, why we don't think that engaging with fossil fuel companies is working, a little bit about some of the commitments that have been made globally and within the UK, and then finally go on to talk about what institutional investors can do. So I'm essentially going to be sharing with you our understanding of why divesting from fossil fuel companies is the best way to take effective climate action and how you go about doing this. So apologies for the very bleak slide. This year, I think the consequences of the climate crisis have been laid bare before our eyes in a more extreme way than ever before. We've seen, obviously, a real increase in the frequency and the severity of extreme weather events. So just a few examples. July was the Earth's hottest month on record. We saw lots of forest fires and wildfires, some of the worst we've ever seen. There's been flash flooding and heat waves. We got the highest ever recorded temperature in Europe of 48.8 degrees centigrade, lots of persistent droughts across Africa, record-breaking snow in Madrid that caused £1.2 billion worth of damage to the city, alongside a global retreat of glaciers and obviously lots of sea level rises. The list really is endless, unfortunately. Over the past 50 years, these events have claimed the lives of millions of people around the world. And it's obviously important to mention that it's the people living in developing nations, i.e. the people that are least responsible for causing this crisis, that have been worst affected by the financial, health and environmental impacts of the crisis. Next slide, please. So in 2015, as I'm sure you're all aware, almost every nation on the Earth signed up to the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, and we agreed to collectively keep the rising global temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius this century and to pursue efforts to keep it below 1.5 degrees Celsius. A new report by the IPCC that came out, I think just a month ago or so, said that under all of the emission scenarios that it considered, both of these targets are going to be broken this century unless huge unprecedented cuts in carbon take place. Carbon emissions, sorry. And we're actually anticipated to hit our target as early as 2034, our target for the rest of the century, where we are at with our current plans and progress. So as you know, anything above 1.5 degrees is going to cause catastrophic climate events like what we've already seen, but again, more frequent and more severe. A report by the UN, which was released just this month, found that the planet needs to slash 45% of its emissions by 2030 to reach carbon neutrality by 2050. And again, under the current emissions commitments from the countries that we have, there's actually due to be a 16% increase in emissions by 2030 compared to our 2010 levels. Meanwhile, another landmark report came out this year, which I wanted to mention, from the International Energy Agency, which sort of map out what the global net zero pathway would look like, essentially a roadmap of the milestones that we need to achieve in order to meet net zero by 2050. And they found two key things that I think are really important to note. The first, that there is no need for new investment in new fossil fuel supply, essentially that we need to begin phasing out fossil fuels, and we already have the investments in place that we need in order to do that. And secondly, that if we are to meet both the Paris and net zero by 2050 targets, then fossil fuel companies must stop all new oil and gas exploration projects this year. Essentially, it's an urgent plea from the IEA to fossil fuel companies to stop looking for and extracting new oil and gas. Next slide, please. So who's to blame? I mean, I think we're all agreed with that there's overwhelming scientific consensus that human activity is responsible for where we're at. But I think it's just very worth noting that it is a very small handful of companies that are responsible for a huge proportion of carbon emissions. So this expose by The Guardian found that it's just 20 fossil fuel companies behind 1/3 of all carbon emissions globally. Next slide, please. So despite all of this kind of where we're at being very bleak potentially, and despite our government sort of trying to position the UK as a climate leader, the government is continuing to provide lots of financial and political support to the fossil fuel industry. So the Prime Minister has made powering past coal, funding the transition to renewables and securing net zero targets from other countries our priority for the upcoming UN climate talks in Glasgow. But we're not going to be taken seriously if we're not practicing what we preach. Unfortunately, there's a new coal mine that might be approved in Cumbria. 800 million barrels of oil are due to be extracted off the coast of Shetland. The UK is still providing over $1 billion in funding for liquid gas drilling overseas in Mozambique. And ministers are currently fighting to try and allow oil drilling to begin in Surrey. So there are a lot of projects, that, all of which actually we're campaigning against at Friends of the Earth through different legal challenges and working with the communities in these places. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of this is all going ahead. And in addition, since signing the Paris Agreement, the government has actually paid £4 billion of public money to North Sea oil and gas companies. In return, these companies have successfully lobbied for massive tax cuts, meaning that they gave us back next to nothing in tax, and at the same time laid off thousands of workers throughout the pandemic. This means the UK is actually the most profitable country in the world for oil and gas producers. Next slide, please. Despite all the doom and gloom, it's not actually too late. The IPCC report that I spoke about before, the authors of that report did make clear that if the world acts quickly and decisively enough, we can get deep cuts in emissions of greenhouse gases, and these could actually stabilise and in some cases even reverse the rise in temperatures that we're seeing. So it is not all too late. I'm just going to talk next about how you as an investor can take action that we think will help drive the political change that we need in order to meet the challenge that's ahead of us. Next slide, please. So simply put, divestment is the opposite of investment. So it's talking about getting rid of stocks, bonds and investment funds that we consider to be unethical or harmful. In this case, I'm talking about moving our money out of the oil, gas and coal industries and into other areas such as renewable energy or other sectors that are kind of doing a lot more positive good in terms of people and planet. So divestment as a sort of strategy, it's a political tactic. It's all about using the institutional power that we have to try and damage the reputation of the industry, revoke its social license to operate, and in turn drive that political action on climate that we really need. En masse, it can also have the very tangible effect of affecting a company's ability to finance its operations, such as drilling for more oil. Next slide, please. So there's a number of reasons why people may want to divest from fossil fuels. Firstly, I think, as everything I've been through already, it's clear that we need to end our support for the fossil fuel industry and begin the sort of rapid transition towards renewables. Fossil fuel companies are the wealthiest and most powerful companies on the planet, and they are continually using their money and their power to block every serious attempt at climate change. So essentially, the agenda of the industry is not really compatible with a safe and healthy future for our planet and the generations that are to come after us. It's also really quite effective. Some research was done earlier this year that found that as an individual, moving your pension to a green fund can have 21 times as much impact in reducing your carbon footprint than giving up flying and becoming a vegan combined. So obviously, if you think about how much impact you could have if a pension fund decided to divest the pensions of the tens of thousands of people who pay into it, the impact is really quite huge. And historically, divestment has been a really effective tactic. So many of you might know that in the 1980s, there was an international divestment effort which helped play a major role in breaking the back of the South African apartheid regime and actually ending segregation. And lastly, I'm going to go on to talk about this in a bit more detail, but it's financially sensible. And I think this has been sort of touched on by some of the previous panelists. Investing in fossil fuels is becoming increasingly risky. So actually, it's quite a practical reason to take some action. Next slide, please. So the financial case for divesting for fossil fuels is becoming more apparent, and there are actually some investors that have divested solely on financial grounds. So some colleagues that I work with at an organisation called Carbon Tracker have spoken a lot about this idea of the carbon bubble bursting. To give you some context of what that means, obviously the UN has warned that we're on course to produce double the amount of fossil fuels than is consistent with the 1.5 degrees target of the Paris Agreement. And that essentially means that the vast majority of reserves that fossil fuel companies have are actually unburnable. However, the share price of companies like BP, Shell and Exxon are all predicated on the idea that all of their assets be counted in the valuation. So eventually, when markets start to wake up to the fact that they're actually never going to be able to sell that last drop of oil, that's what's known as when the carbon bubble will burst. So the image on the slide there kind of just shows you how much budget we essentially have to burn and how much these companies are being valued based on their assets. So in other words, yeah, they're currently being quite grossly overvalued, and in reality, a large proportion of these assets will end up stranded, aka not really worth anything and not burnable, not sellable. It's estimated in Europe alone that when this happens, there's going to be over 1 trillion euros worth of assets that will be stranded. And it makes the fossil fuel industry increasingly risky to invest in, particularly for long-term investors like pension funds. And I just wanted to note that the quote on the slide is from Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England. So this isn't a fringe view. It's quite a commonly held view, not just for us sort of green loonies eating hummus, as some people like to send Friends of the Earth activists in their inboxes. And I also want to talk a little bit about sort of returns that investors can hope to see on a fossil-free portfolio. So I think some of the other panelists on the second panel mentioned this. Fossil fuel stocks are on a downward trajectory. The entire industry obviously suffered massive losses in 2020, and it's set to continue, really. The modelling by the IEA as part of their report that I mentioned just before predicted that global oil demand is about to decline from what is currently 90 million barrels a day at present to 24 million barrels a day by just 2030. So it's about to become, there's a lot less demand essentially due to all of the sort of climate legislation that's being passed and things like that. As a result, the industry is already struggling to make a surplus. So it has actually been borrowing and selling assets to make payouts to its shareholders. So in 2020, a report found that oil super majors made £20 billion in profits, but spent almost 50 billion to try and please their investors. So they're kind of trying to make everything look as though it's okay when really they're actually struggling a little bit financially. And there have also been a number of reports and modelling studies that have shown that a fossil-free portfolio can actually give equivalent or even higher returns in some cases. So I've listed a couple of examples on there of a MSCI 10-year study that found that all of its fossil-free portfolio performed better. And same was also found by BlackRock earlier this year. So overall, renewables are steadily getting more profitable and fossil fuels are declining. So we're kind of encouraging smart investors to take their money out of fossil fuels now before they see the value of their investments crash and burn, as we have seen with other industries that have sort of taken a bit of a hit. Next slide, please. So I hope I'm not rattling through these. So next up, I want to talk a little bit about sort of stewardship and engagement with fossil fuel companies. So one of the sort of key arguments that's made against divestment today is that instead of divesting your portfolios, what investors who are really passionate about climate action should do is hold on to those fossil fuel stocks and bonds and use this as an opportunity to influence companies to do better on environmental issues. And while I think shareholder engagement strategies are super important and very effective in trying to get companies to improve their social and environmental and governance practices, for instance, trying to get supermarkets to reduce plastic packaging or getting a cleaning company to pay its staff a living wage. I've worked on campaigns like that, and it's a very effective tactic. The reality is that there's very limited evidence to suggest that in this specific example of trying to get fossil fuel companies to be greener, engagement is just not going to give us the outcomes that we need. So in order to keep warming below the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold, the measure of successful engagement with a fossil fuel company would be that they commit to keeping the vast majority of their oil, gas and coal stocks in the ground, that they stop exploring for more reserves, and that they rapidly transition to becoming almost entirely renewable companies. But the reality is that throughout the history of engagement with fossil fuel companies, and this has been going on for many years, no major oil or gas company has deviated from the primary objective of extracting and burning fossil fuels. And there is no historic evidence of shareholder engagement ever managing to change a sector's core business model. We're essentially asking fossil fuel companies to stop selling fossil fuels. And it's very different than, as I said, asking a supermarket to stop using plastic, which isn't its core business practice. So in 2020, a study of the largest pension funds in the world, which represented ownership of over 70 billion in fossil fuel assets, the researchers found only one example of direct engagement with a fossil fuel firm where the company was asked to keep their fossil fuel assets in the ground. And even this did not lead to a commitment to do so from the firm. And as you can see on the slide, generally the shareholder resolutions in this sort of area are rarely successful. And even when they are, they're often non-binding. So we often don't get the outcomes that we need. I also want to speak briefly about the sort of net zero pledges that these companies are facing, these companies are committing to, and sort of why we should be careful about taking those pledges at face value. Most of the fossil fuel companies have now made a pledge to be net zero by 2050, but in reality, these plans don't actually prevent them from expanding their core business, burning and extracting more fossil fuels. And in reality, the plans are actually premised on largely impossible carbon capture and removal targets. So a study by Oxfam earlier this year found that the net zero plans of just 4 of the big oil and gas producers, that was Shell, BP, Total Energies and Eni, would require an area of land twice the size of the UK for the offsetting that they've put forward. So, taking all of these companies into account, the amount of land that's needed for the offsetting is just unfeasible and impossible. So I think we should definitely take the effort to look more closely at where these targets are coming from. Next slide, please. So I also just wanted to mention that there is a lot of greenwash and marketing around how green these companies are. But on average, investments in low carbon projects are between 1% and 3% of the annual spending of fossil fuel companies around the world. Sometimes they spend more on marketing of their green products than they spend on the green products themselves. they're often overstating their contribution in the transition through marketing, whilst, as the other half of the slide shows, putting millions towards lobbying governments to prevent climate action. And in some cases, this recent report by investigation by Global Justice Now has found that there are actually lots of fossil fuel companies actually suing governments for them taking action on climate change. So it's hard to say that there's that much going towards the actual transition, and quite a lot going in the opposite direction, unfortunately. Next slide, please. So it is becoming increasingly clear that these companies aren't really changing at the speed that the climate crisis demands. So there's no fossil fuel major is on track to meet our internationally agreed 2050 target, despite the plans that they've put in place. And institutional investors have actually lost faith in the industry to resolve the problem, as you can see from the second quote on that slide. So I think this kind of begs the question, why are so many investors continuing to spend so much time, effort, and money into these sort of stewardship efforts if so few actually believe that the companies can change? It's a question I'm pondering a lot. So overall, I think really you can categorize this as fossil fuel companies moving from what was a politics of climate denial 10 or 20 years ago to the politics of climate delay. Really, let's see how far we can push it. Let's pretend we're making impact. Let's pretend we're making effort. See how far we can go until the final drop is out of the ground. But we really haven't got time to wait and hope that these for these companies to change, unfortunately. So divestment is not necessarily a new thing. Probably about 5 or 6 years ago, we started seeing an increase in commitments. Now we've got over 1,300 institutions worldwide whose assets total over $14 trillion that have made commitments. I will just mention some of the big wins on the slide there. Recently, Harvard University just last month committed to divest from fossil fuels, probably the most prestigious university that's done so far. It's really great that the Republic of Ireland as a country has divested, as well as a number of cities globally, including New York and Melbourne, and lots of also UK commitments, including faith institutions, local authority pension funds, all trying to kind of reduce the exposure of their funds to fossil fuels and moving their money out. Next slide, please. Sorry, I feel like I'm rambling through this. So I just want to quickly make a comment on sort of like how you might go about doing this and the practical steps of how to do so. So the first thing you need to do is to make a policy commitment that's kind of distinct from just a temporary shift in investment. It needs to be public. That's the really important thing. I forgot to write that on the slide, but making a public statement about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and encouraging others that you work with to do the same is a really crucial part of this, as it is a political campaign. The commitment should be to immediately freeze any new investment in fossil fuel companies and to withdraw existing investments in these companies over a sensible but definitive time frame. People usually set 3 to 5 years to make sure that they have time to do that in a way that's sensible and doesn't negatively impact the fund. And the commitment should cover both direct and commingled investments. And I guess you can set your definition of what you're classing as a fossil fuel company and what companies you'd like to exclude from your portfolio. You can speak to your consultants about how to do that and how to make that decision. For some people, they might set that as any company that has more than 5% of their expenditure in fossil fuel production, which means you can still include some companies that are very steadily on a transition actually out of fossil fuels. And there is also the option to think more broadly than just fossil fuels, to actually think about excluding other industries from your portfolio, like livestock or aviation, depending on what you want to do. I am conscious of the time, so I just want to mention about sort of people who aren't yet ready to divest, but how you may be able to change your engagement strategy to be perhaps a little bit more effective. So I think we really see engagement as a negotiating position is only effective if there is an explicit threat of the possibility that you're going to withdraw your funds at some point. So, you know, investors that have been investing in the same company for 25 years, kind of submitting questions and, you know, never actually acting based on the response that they get from their resolutions or questions that they submit to these companies, I think should really give yourself like a strict time limit and strict outcomes that you want to get out of the engagement with the company. And if you aren't happy with the outcomes, then you can threaten to divest or divest from them at that point. So, you know, if you want to say by next year, this company needs to have committed to stop exploring by 2030, then you can kind of set those targets. And then if you aren't happy with them and you don't feel like the progress is being made at the pace that's necessary, then you can threaten to divest or divest from that company. I also want to note that if you don't currently own shares in a company, there's no evidence that actually interacting as a prospective investor is any less effective in influencing their practices. So you can potentially still have a lot of influence as a prospective investor without actually having to put any of your money into these companies and potentially, you know, risking what goes with that. And finally, just to wrap up, I just wanted to note that the eyes of the world are obviously on the UK as we prepare to host COP26 in November. So it's a prime opportunity for us to set an example to other nations and also to our own government about what we need to be doing. We believe that divesting from fossil fuels is a great way for institutional investors to take meaningful and substantive climate action and really to show leadership in the face of this challenge. Overall, we believe that fossil fuel companies are not adapting at the speed that this crisis necessitates, and obviously in many ways are still actively working to prevent vital progress and legislation on climate change. So divestment is a really powerful way to vote with your feet, take a bold stance against an industry that's really destructive to both people and planet, and most importantly, push our government to take urgent action to protect future generations. Next slide, please. I've probably gone on for too long, but I just want to put our website and email address where you can find resources. We've also got a couple of social media channels that you can find us at. And please do take down the email address in case you'd like to send over any questions about how to discuss any of the stuff I've mentioned, or if you want to have a discussion about how you'd go about divesting your assets. And yeah, thank you so much. And I look forward to taking some of your questions.
Called Charles Pringle wants to know, why do you believe that engagement will not be effective, especially because this is pension schemes that are watching this now are long-term investors?
I think I kind of covered the engagement stuff enough. I think it's because the urgency of the climate crisis and the scale of what we're dealing with is so severe. We really do need these companies to be moving at such a greater pace than they currently are. And there just really isn't any evidence that, you know, from the engagement that's been done so far, that these companies have made any commitments to keep fossil fuels in the ground and to stop exploring for more oil. I think the slide of, you know, all of those UK government projects of which, you know, Shell and BP and Total are, you know, involved in, just goes to show that they are still actively currently seeking to extract more oil from the ground. And we just don't have time to wait for these companies to change. They really, 2050 really is too late. We need action within the next couple of years, unfortunately. So that's kind of just our position on it.
Okay, good. Another viewer, Mark Jevons, he pointed out Ørsted, which I believe is a Norwegian company. It was an oil company. It's now transformed into a renewable energy focused company. So that has shown change can happen. Does that give you confidence?
I will have to look into that. Just to, yeah, I'm, you know, I'm not an expert in every company that exists, but I will definitely look into Ørsted and see, look at what the kind of process was for the people's engagement with that company and why it made that transition, because I'd be really interested to see that. So thank you for bringing that up.
That's the interesting thing. I don't know why Ørsted decided to change completely from dirty energy to clean energy. It could be that the boards, we saw that's the way it was going to go, but it's like maybe it was a lot of engagement from people who own the stock. So maybe that could be a good example of where engagement actually works.
Yeah, I was also going to say as well that the divestment movement has been like noted by some of the big companies like Shell and BP as like a risk within their sort of like company reports. And I think the CEO of Shell said that it was, you know, a real threat to them. So it's also possible that maybe both divestment and engagement in tandem, knowing that some investors are going to revoke their support for these companies, can drive them to actually change faster. Like I said, that sort of voting with your feet in tandem with, you know, other people doing the more long-term engagement efforts. So I'm not trying to totally rubbish it at all. There's a role for everyone to play in this.
Interesting. If people do decide they want to vote with their feet, they want to divest from a particular company, I mean, what should they do first? Should they just divest, or they speak to their consultants, their asset managers or advisors and think, is this the best way to go about it? Or should just take the step there and then? What do you think? That's the best approach?
I think it's really important to speak to your consultants, but I think what they should do first is make kind of the political decision that that is what you want to do, and then direct your consultants to help you make the best of that situation. I think, unfortunately, sometimes consultants can encourage people not to make the decisions that they want to make. That's, I think, often the situation with some of the local council pension funds we've worked with. So I would say definitely work with your consultants and, you know, the asset managers that you work with, get advice from them and the most sensible way to do this and how to go about it. But I think you need to maybe make the decision yourself as an institution about how you want to be spending your money and whether you want to be investing in these companies or not, because it can be done sensibly and safely. So it's just about getting the support to make sure you can do it.
Okay. Another question from the floor. If I was quite a small pension scheme, maybe I had £7 million worth of stock in BP, for example, and I said, okay, well, I'm off now. I mean, that's not really going to worry the chief executive, is it? So how can I, with my very small voice, how can I make a bigger impact?
I think that's why divestment is such a powerful campaign, because it's not necessarily about the amount of money that you have. It's about the kind of reputational damage that a divestment commitment brings to the industry. So even though BP aren't going to be crying about losing that £1 million or whatever it is, being able to put out a press release and say, this is what we're doing, this is why, encouraging other investors to do the same, and kind of beginning that conversation within the public sphere about why we need to revoke this social license for these companies to operate, is really where the change happens. And that's how we get the movement we need from our government to actually put the steps in place to invest in a green transition that we need, to invest in green jobs. That is where the effect comes from these kind of campaigns, I think.
Quite interesting, well, because there are pressure groups, shareholder pressure groups such as Climate Action 100+, where a lot of smaller schemes and quite large schemes are all coming together and they're having a unified voice. So that does seem to be one option for pension schemes, for insurers, if they do want to make a difference and they have a very small voice. So, that is all we have time for on day one of this ESG Club webinar. Goodbye. Thank you.